Welcome to the On the Rise podcast, where we talk about time freedom, passive investing through real estate, finance, and mindset. Let's dive in. Quick disclaimer as always, I am not a CPA, I am not an attorney or a financial advisor. This is not financial advice. I am not telling you or anyone else what to do. The views and opinions expressed in these podcasts are provided for education and informational purposes only and are not necessarily the views of my employer. All right, welcome back On the Rise podcast listeners. Thank you again for jumping into yet another episode of the On the Rise podcast. I've got another amazing guest with me today. I've got Tom Suvansri. Tom, welcome to the show.
Jeremy, thanks for having me on. I'm really excited to meet with you today.
Yeah, likewise. I'm looking forward to chopping it up with you. So I've known Tom for maybe a couple years now, and I've gotten to know him, as a partner and an investor. So definitely looking forward to learning a little bit more about Tom's background and what you're focused on today, really. So maybe you can kind of take us back where it all kind of started, with your business. I know you help high income, individuals and business owners deploy capital into tax efficient real estate and private investments. So maybe you can kind of unpack, the background, how you got to where you're at today and, really what you're focused on.
Yeah, so I'll start a little bit before getting into my business because obviously a lot of that stuff sort of, helped me sort of shape my own thinking about finances and personal finances because I worked in a corporate finance role for quite some time in a large pharmaceutical company and doing the normal thing, working my normal job and trekking into the city daily without like the rest of the drones walking in and checking in, checking out. And it served its purpose for a while. And as that for a lot of folks, and maybe some of your listeners too, it becomes almost like background noise. You just kind of just get into a routine. And to me, it started to wear away. And obviously at the time, building wealth, it served that purpose. But at the same sort of vein, I was starting to realize a lot of the typical financial advice was kind of similar, right? In that way, it was just the mainstream. There really wasn't a lot of stuff around it. Everyone was saying the same thing, and it was just kind of a normal drumbeat. And so that's where it shaped for me. Like I had to look outside. I had to explore further. And I'm sure that's why a lot of your audience are on here because they think the same way, right? They're looking for more and looking for new ideas and creative ways. And I started doing that for myself, exploring real estate, alternative ways to invest, how to reduce my taxes legally, all these things I was doing without the help of an advisor because they weren't really talking about these things. Neither was my CPA. And so that's all the stuff that was born out of it. And through the course of time, I was able to extract myself. I say I'm like a refugee from the corporate world a little bit, like to be able to start this business and say, how can I help others see these things too? Almost like getting out of the system to see what else is out there that you might connect with that aligns to your values and how you see the world. And to me, that's where I went down. And I said it was just a blessing because although it was scary initially, it's like one of those freeing moments that I still reflect on some days. I said it took me so long and the courage to do it. Now the jungle is wide open. Life is wide open, and it's really opened up a completely different world for me.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that because I think about the same thing. Like I always kind of ask myself, why did I not become a corporate refugee, 10 years earlier, than I did? And so now I have the pleasure of talking to a number of other individuals on their kind of journey, to being able to do the same, in the future. So really appreciate your perspective there. I know that a big kind of proponent of what you speak about, to investors is really kind of this maybe misconception around this concept that people have about tax efficient investing. And where do you think that most people are kind of getting that wrong from your vantage point?
Yeah, and I think this is all starting at a good spot, but because most people take the corporate world. I mean, the advice around reducing taxes was okay, defer, right? Put your money as much as humanly possible into 401ks, IRAs, whatever, and you're relegated to a very small pool of types of investments, right? The market based, the things that they consider safe, that are allowed for the common folk like you and me. So it's all about deferral and without a whole heck of a lot of thought around how am I going to exit these things down the road tax efficiently. So it's very narrow band of more what's a near term and not thinking about how can I create and architect my entire financial life to be more tax efficient. Outside of that, what other investments should I be considering? Well, how should I be strategizing on this throughout my years so that when I get to use my or want to use my assets, I get to use them and have more control of them with the least amount of taxes. So I think that is what I slowly realized that not many people were talking about it because it was just paycheck, defer, and someday I'll get to use it. We'll figure that out down the road. Well, that's a very reactionary sort of approach. I think unfortunately that's what happens. And so, then people get to the end, they're like, this is not exactly what I had signed up for or thought was going to happen. And so it takes some effort to kind of proactively think about and get around the right people because unfortunately, a lot of tax professionals, although they do really good work, are very focused on compliance. And they're not helping people think about how to strategically reduce their taxes in a legal manner. Just want to report it. Unfortunately, that's just a reality of what's happening.
Yeah, it makes total sense. And it's interesting because just in full disclosure, I have tried to have a number of different financial advisors, on this podcast that are primarily centered around, advising their clients on Wall Street related investments. And they're not actually allowed, per, broker dealer laws and so forth, to talk about alternative investments in real estate. So I think, Wall Street is a great vehicle for the common man to invest, right? And there are tax advantages depending upon the structure of the investment. But I think what you're saying is that there are tax efficient investing strategies that the common man, maybe the not high net worth investor or the small business owner can actually leverage and deploy in order to help mitigate taxes. Am I saying that right, Tom?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and it struck me one day when I first started thinking about it, and I think it was Tom Wheelwright may have said this back in the day, it's, if you gotta, you got to change your facts, right? To change your taxes. Like you have to change your facts around how you think about it. And it's just a set of incentives that the government puts forth and sort of thinking in a more positive way. What do they actually want us to do? Right. And that to me really changed my lens around it to say, okay, could I invest in a way that's tax efficient, supports me, but actually benefits society? Right. Not only just me and my pocketbook and or my bank account, but could actually benefit others in this world in a positive manner that the government can't do themselves. They don't want to make money doing anything, right? All they're doing is charging for revenue, so they don't have anything to sell. And so, to me, it really changed the lens of how I thought about it, and it really made it more positive.
Yeah, makes total sense to me. I know that you've probably heard this before. I know that a lot of investors listening to this have heard of this concept of what we call generational wealth, right? So, my question for you, Tom, is what does that actually look like structurally for an investor or an individual behind the scenes?
Yeah, it's interesting, and this is one even just through my own evolution for myself, and some of this I'll think about it because especially was growing up and especially working a job, everything was very external, thinking about money, right? Growth. And unfortunately, my parents were not, were, my father was a doctor, came over here, just wasn't good with money. He could treat patients well, not really smart with money. So you didn't really learn anything through that. So you had to kind of just figure it out. And what I've come to realize is that the money, yes, that's really where a lot of the planning typically is focused. And it's important, right? Especially if you're thinking about state taxes and other things that are coming down the road for some people, but and transferring of wealth. But what I think is a missing piece in probably most people's lives is that how are you preparing the next generations for that wealth? To use it properly, to use it with the values that are aligned with you and your family and what you care about, and preparing them to receive the money, not just get the most of dollars out of it, which is usually the focal point, but like how can you train them in a way that they can use it wisely and hopefully build it even further down in generations and generations. But that's sometimes a more difficult conversation that people don't want to talk about, right? You're talking about death. You're talking about, you know, a taboo topic like money, right? let's diffuse that thing. It's just money. It's a tool to help us live our best life. So we have to talk amongst our family members and educate them on what it means and what it's used for. It's a tool. Don't make it more than it is. So that I think is a bigger piece that I think people do not often talk about. And it even took me personally a while to get to there because it can get uncomfortable, right? You're talking to my kids about, hey, here's the money we have, right? The assets we have. Someday I might walk off this earth and someday it might be in your hands. Now you're responsible. So are you preparing them for that?
Yeah, totally. And that even goes beyond, just having a family trust or a will, in place, and it's interesting because, and you're right, it's a taboo topic. And I'm kind of, I'm a part of the faith-based, community. And regularly, I've heard the saying before that the Bible talks more about money than it does the topic of love. Right. And so it's one of those things where we don't talk about it enough, I think. And so I think you're spot on. I think it's important to have an open and transparent, conversation, with your children, maybe with your parents if they're still, alive, those types of things, really to kind of, settle those things out. And there are strategic, moves that you can make to really protect, that I guess we'll call it a nest egg or generational wealth. Am I correct in saying that?
Oh, yeah, yeah, and that's exactly the type of, planning, and there's so many people that I run across too that, don't even have a basic estate plan in place. Right, just something basic, powers of attorney, like nothing super fancy that, a Rockefeller family wouldn't be, that's his baseline, because they assume these things won't happen or they don't have enough wealth where it matters. Well, there's a lot of other aspects to it than just wealth, right? So I think it's key to for people just to um, it takes planning, right? It takes willingness to take action on it, just like anything, just like going to invest in real estate, right? You don't just go from 1 to 100 miles per hour in a second. But these are topics that need to be discussed and over time evolve because, even where we start with a plan, it's going to change anyway. Just it should.
I'm
It
Zach
should.
Haptonstall, CEO and co-founder of Rise 48 Equity. Our goal is to help you protect and grow your wealth by investing in the large multifamily apartment buildings. We do all the work as far as sourcing these large apartment buildings from the brokers, doing all of the on-site management with our vertically integrated property management company, doing all the renovations with our vertically integrated construction company. We completely rebrand the exteriors. We will renovate the interiors to our full platinum level scope, which increases the value of the asset to get that profit margin for the investor. If you'd like to learn about how you can partner with us on these exciting opportunities, and go to our website and set up a call with our team.
Well, let's double click on this, real estate, investing, kind of topic. And I'd like to speak to that individual that's still actively earning a paycheck, right? The active earner. How do you recommend that type of an individual really balances, being liquid enough with the fact that a lot of real estate investments are really illiquid investments, right? So how do you balance it for that active income earner that needs to have a certain amount of, liquidity, but also, is in a position where they're willing to or able to lock up, some additional funds in an illiquid real estate investment for maybe an unforeseen amount of time?
Yeah, and I think you put it so well because I think what often gets missed because when we think about, and I use this term diversification loosely, right? But a lot of folks when they think about that, they're really just focused on what their stock portfolio is. That's usually what we're taught, right? How do I diversify into small cap, large cap, whatever growth, and those things. And I think really where you're positioning real estate, business, other things is trying to take a broader lens of your asset allocation, right? And where it's positioned. Right, where things like stocks and bonds and mutual funds fit in is that they maybe don't have as much dispersion and returns over long periods of time, but they're more liquid, right? Especially inside a brokerage account, right? But it's probably not going to give you the outsized returns over long periods of time, right? More steadier, eddy type world versus like a real estate or private business. Other things have, to me, much higher upside to them, but you have to do a trade off because there are probably some illiquid aspects to them. You just have to recognize that those assets, you got to expect them to be long term, right? In that fashion, and just kind of position that way. And then obviously have the liquidity that keeps you sound at night, safe, right? Because opportunities and unfortunate mishaps happen. right? Having that safety valve will keep you protected. And so that's why it's so key to kind of think more broadly about it, and widening out. And that's why, like, and then knowing what you're getting into and the purpose of it. And I always tie this back to purpose because everyone that I often get asked that question, like, "Well, where should I invest?" I said, "Well, what are you investing for? Like, what's this thing you're building towards? You're trying to use?" Because again, if we go back to the concept, it's a tool, right? It's just a tool to drive your life, not the other way around. Unfortunately, that's what happens more often.
Yeah, totally agree with you on that 100%. And it's funny that you say that too, because I'm a big proponent of diversification as well, but you have to kind of balance that with, what's the right, balance, right? And regularly I'll have investors that will reach out to me and they'll say, "Hey, Jeremy, I want to diversify into real estate. And I want to basically, self-direct all of my old 401k or all of my old, IRA, into, a real estate investment opportunity." And my advice for them is really one that is pump the brakes, right? I don't want you to put all of your, money into a specific real estate deal or even multiple real estate deals for that matter. I think it's a prudent approach, as an investor to really be, diversified in both Wall Street and Main Street, which real estate, of course, being an option, as a Main Street type, investment. And I never think it's a prudent thing for everybody to have all of their, chips in one particular, spot, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think some of it also goes into the learning curve of where people are and what they think about it, and that's why even on my personal journey with it, I didn't invest in real estate immediately. I lent money to an investor who was a seasoned investor, and I said, "Can you teach me some stuff, right? And I'll loan you money because that's what you needed." I had no knowledge. So I said, okay, let's find someone who actually knows what the heck they're doing and serve their needs. And then I benefited from it. Right. And so even those simple concepts, we were like, you loan somebody money contracts, you could set these things up. They're not, it's a bank, right? You play the bank, right? In some scenarios, but you got to learn these things and then find where maybe you're best suited um, for your skill set or desire to be active or not, right? Those are all important key elements. And but you don't maybe know that until you kind of get into it and experience it.
Yeah, makes total sense. So I know that there's a lot of noise in the alternative, world right now around, real estate, private equity, cryptocurrency, other types of alternatives. How do you help people kind of filter through some of that noise?
Yeah, I think right now that's the absolute perfect word for it is noise, right? Because you talk to different folks, and I've talked to folks who are working in say Blackstone or something, and versus someone who is a small player, and in some cases I think of real estate being somewhat they can say you can blanket a real estate market. Well, you know better than me, Jeremy, how localized things can be. And so that's where it gets so key to figure out who you're operating with, right? In certain cases, where am I allocating my money, right? And how are they connected in here? And who are the operators and can you trust them? What do you know about how they operate and their performance? And so to me, that it takes energy and time to do that, right? I know your audience members are probably super busy with life, family, jobs, but to put your hard-earned money here, people put their money in the stock market without even thinking about where it's really going, right? And to me, that is a dangerous thing. So in that case, I'd say you got to spend the time to know who you're quote unquote getting in bed with, right? Because you might be in it for a little while, right? Especially these alternative ones, or private ones, could be 3, 5, and sometimes extended further. Are you in with people that can weather storms? Because things will happen, whether we want them to or not. Are they strong enough to deal with it and have good integrity and you can trust them they're going to act on your behalf, right? And I've learned that the hard way over time, right? Where people who I thought were trustworthy, had our best interests in heart, and then all of a sudden when things turn poorly, they're like awful, right? It just run for the hills. And so I've seen that enough now to recognize, hey, you got to slow down a little bit, like you said, and learn, get comfortable. There are more deals. Don't rush into it because every time I did that, I get bit.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that you brought that up. And a lot of times people, they invest in the shiny pitch deck, right? That happens in Wall Street investments as well with some of the main, some of the biggest institutional players, in the space. I mean, these guys spend billions of dollars a year in commercials and advertising to get people to invest, into them and their platforms and their investment, products. But chasing after the shiny new pitch deck is not a strategy, when it comes to real estate investing. And I would even argue, you're not even really investing in the deal itself. You're investing in the operator and their ability, like you said, to weather the storm. I like to use the expression that birds fly, fish swim, and real estate falls apart, right? It's just what happens. There's constantly headwinds, occurring, which is why it also makes it an attractive investment if you're partnered, with the right operator. So, but by the time this podcast episode airs, it's going to be midway through 2026. And I'd like to talk about the timing of making investments from a tax perspective. We regularly get a lot of investors that reach out to us on December 15th asking if we have any real estate deals that they can get involved with and invest into because they're looking for that last minute, passive tax depreciation to help them mitigate their tax burden for that year, right? Maybe you can kind of talk through why that's not necessarily always the best type of approach, to really make investment decisions, when, the shot clock is almost to zero.
Oh my goodness, how much time we got here? So yeah, we've seen this as a problem. And again, I know it's a product of a lot of things, right? People are busy, time is difficult. They maybe you lose track of it. But yeah, we've seen this a lot. And unfortunately, what ends up happening, and and we've seen this even as closely as last year, where people coming out of left field, and what ends up happening is a few things. One, obviously, everything gets rushed, right? And the due diligence required to review things and get the right players involved, advisors in their world together to actually properly analyze it in their situation gets sort of cut, right? And that doesn't actually do good for anybody, right? Because you're rushed, you feel like you're missing pieces. It's a more of an emotional sort of push, and frankly, a lot of the options are going to be gone, right? So you're swimming with a fewer set of options now because you're in desperate mode, and so you have fewer options, fewer time to really review and see if it's right for you, and so you're kind of just I'm taking a flyer, right? Without the proper due diligence, just like any investment, I treat the tax strategies around this the same way, right? You need to get the right players. And unfortunately, a lot of people, just like their normal financial life, their advisors are all kind of just siloed, right? They rarely talk together. What we try to encourage is plan well ahead of time. We're trying to talk to people now because there are certain strategies that are in place today and new ones will pop up, right? Or evolve, and you have plenty of time to evolve it and modify what you're even doing. Like something as basic, reduce your if you know you're going to do this tax strategy, you can adjust your withholdings from your employer, right? Keep some of the money because you're going to deploy it, right? How do I fund something? Well, one way to do it is stop giving it to the holding tank for the IRS, right? You keep it and start using it and deploy it down the road, but you got to get ahead of it, right? And so now we are, the time recording around tax season, everyone's just in a frenzy and it probably is most painful. This is actually the right time to be thinking about it and planning because a lot of these things could have not only intra-year impacts, but further down the road, right? And it takes some time to sort of energy to sort of go through those so people know what they're getting into. So unfortunately, it's the summary: fewer options, probably bad decision making, right? And lack of coordination with your entire financial life. If that doesn't spell disaster to me, I don't know what is, right? And so I would encourage people to get ahead of it.
Yeah, absolutely. To me, the takeaway is to be proactive and not, reactive. And speaking about being proactive, what might be one or two different ways that our listening audience can connect with you, Tom, offline to learn more about what you're up to?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, so obviously I have my own podcast, the Perennial Pride podcast and have great guests like Jeremy others on there, like just to share other areas of the finance world that maybe are not sort of on the mainstream. Certainly my website, perennialpride.com, be great, and you can connect with me there.
It's great. Well, I really appreciate your time here, Tom, and the tremendous value that you've brought our listening audience.
Thank you, Jeremy. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Absolutely. And on the Rise podcast listeners, thank you again for jumping into yet another episode. We look forward to having you join us on the next episode.
Thank you for hanging out with us today and for listening to the On the Rise podcast. This show is for entertainment purposes only. Nothing said on this show should be considered financial advice. Before making any financial decisions, please consult with a professional. This show is copyrighted by the On the Rise podcast. Written permissions must be granted before syndication or rebroadcasting.